My next guest is a writer for the NFL media. He is a columnist for the NFL.com, as well as a member of the Around the NFL podcast and TV show. Ladies and gentlemen, recurring guest, three-time guest. I don't think that's the thing. Three-time guest, Mr. Marc Sessler. Marc, is everything going for you?
I'm doing good. Yeah, it's like I think we do this about once a year, it seems. So thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely.
That's nice of you.
I appreciate you taking time. So draft just wrapped up a couple weeks ago. Kind of have some interesting storylines circulating in the NFL right now. Want to kind of get your take on it and see kind of like things you've heard and maybe different perspectives of kind of what's going on. Maybe so people can kind of learn about that stuff a little bit more. And obviously, the number one thing is Tim Tebow is now the tight end for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Do you see him making the team?
Well, we talked about this on our show yesterday, and I guess I agree from like a physical angle. I mean, if you look at like the players that have skipped this vast amount of time and then try to come back into the NFL, there's really only like 7 or 8 of them, and some of them are from way back when in like the 30s. There aren't a lot of real examples. I mean, and Doug Flutie did, but that's because he was playing elsewhere. So to stop playing football at all, to go do other things with life, broadcasting, to attempt a Mets career, and then come back and to be his age. I mean, in any other situation than the Jaguars, I would say no. There's literally probably no chance. That it's like it's a nice sort of headline and it creates some intrigue and media chat talk points. But the only thing I would think of a little bit that gives it a possibility is just Urban Meyer, that this is his guy. I mean, he loves Tim Tebow, and I think that Tim Tebow is someone that you can use in a lot of different ways. I think he'd have to be more than just a tight end. He'd probably be, there's already people putting out plays showing Tebow being used in so many different ways when he was last here. Immense odds stacked against it happening. But the fact that they did it is already so illogical. Like the fact that they signed him is so bizarre and illogical. And I don't think it's just for, media attention, because it's kind of like we did in the Tebow thing. We're a little bit over it and we're past it. So, I mean, do they think he can be someone that on a team with a lot of young players and a young quarterback can be a leader? And maybe that's even just through the offseason process and then he doesn't make the team. But the fact that they did it to me is so bizarre that there must be thinking in Urban Meyer's camp that there is faith that he can use Tebow in a certain way. I don't think you just do it to make Tebow go through the process with no chance. And what did they tell Tim Tebow? You have no chance to make this roster, but we're doing this just for giggles. So it's a weird move. I think the problem is like, where is his body at? I love to have my body at age 32, but apparently for him, that's a big negative. Wait and see. But if he can still play, if he can look like he did back then, I think they did it for a reason. But like football is a pretty sparse in what allows you to do if you leave for so long. So it's a huge uphill climb for him.
Do you think it's to deflect pressure off Trevor Lawrence?
I see people saying that, but I think like you don't draft Trevor Lawrence if you're concerned about how he can take the pressure. I mean, Trevor Lawrence is like, no one's expecting the Jacksonville Jaguars. He wasn't like the cherry on top of a Super Bowl roster. They've done a lot to make that roster better than it was. And they weren't as terrible as their record last year. They were close in a certain amount of games, and you could see them. They were a better team than their finishing mark was. But I don't think when it comes to Trevor Lawrence, you're thinking we need to protect him, we need to shield him. There's really nothing about the Trevor Lawrence story that suggests that. I mean, he's gone at every stage of his career, high school into college, and overachieved and met expectations or overachieved. And I think the Jaguars drafted him thinking he'll do that again. So, and if anything, I think the thing about Tebow is I think he burnt out. I think the Tebow experience burnt out locker rooms in the past, and like especially with the Jets. I mean, it was a total circus, and so there's a risk involved. I don't think it helps anyone at all on that front, because it's probably going to bring, if people do latch onto this Tebow thing beyond a week or two, it's going to bring more reporters and more press into a locker room that has one of the smaller network of beat reporters. Jacksonville's sort of on the outskirts. That used to be the way the San Diego Chargers were. It was like you could bring players there, like Manti Te'o when he went to San Diego. One of the people thought the upside was he's sort of out of the media glare out there, and I think Jacksonville's the same way. So it's not a terrible landing spot for a number 1 overall pick.
And then I wanted to ask you, obviously the big bombshell during the draft was the reports that Aaron Rodgers wants out of Green Bay after a long history of kind of disappointments, him not really being on the same page as the front office and maybe him potentially wanting greener pastures. What % chance do you think there is that he's already played his last down of football if they don't want to trade him?
60.
Really?
Because this whole story to me exists because Aaron Rodgers is a different type of quarterback than many we've seen before. He's hosting Jeopardy. He has extreme interests outside of the sport. And I think the drafting of Jordan Love, trading up for him, it's no secret that, the minute that happened, he was talking about his career with Green Bay ending. So it just feels like, we're in this world now where quarterbacks in general are demanding more respect. They want to be part of decision-making. They don't want to be sideswiped and embarrassed by decisions. I think that move to get Love was embarrassing to Aaron Rodgers. And, it's no small thing to me that a year later on the draft, the story comes out. I understand that Aaron Rodgers says, he didn't plan for that to happen at all, or the timing. I think the thing here is why it could be lower than 60 is that Green Bay's desire to move on from Aaron Rodgers is probably much closer to zero. They technically own the leverage. There were reports today that they'd offered him, they're working on him on concept of a massive extension. Maybe that'll do it. But where we stand right now, I just think that if you get to a point where you already drafted the quarterback that's meant to be a successor. So when you did that, you created this huge problem. And Aaron Rodgers does not have to play. He can sit out. And that to me is really tricky because it resembles what probably would have been the Deshaun Watson scenario if all that hadn't gone in another direction. And then if you're the Texans in that case, minus all the off-field stuff, do you play a game of chicken all season long and have to start someone else? I mean, if Aaron Rodgers will not play and they will not trade him and we lose him for a year, then it becomes closer to, the Carson Palmer situation, which ultimately the Bengals, they had leverage there too, but they had to move on. And then someone came with an offer, Hugh Jackson of all people, that they couldn't turn down. And so I just think at some point he would not be with the Packers if he doesn't want to be a Packer today.
I was watching I don't know if you saw the 30 for 30 from a couple years ago, Elway to Marino.
Yeah, I've seen that. It's been a while, but yeah.
So I was watching it last night, and I completely. I wasn't born, but I didn't realize how long it took the Colts to trade Elway. They didn't get a good return at all. So you think, especially with some of the other, especially with Washington botching the trade for Trent Williams, I remember reports were coming out they could potentially get maybe one or maybe a 1+ more. They ended up getting a conditional third. If you lose him for a year, I don't know if you saw him with the Derby, his hair is looking he looks like a wizard, and he looks suspiciously skinny. If he likes the Jeopardy thing, I don't think he's bluffing. So if you hold off on a year, you see what Jordan Love does, and Jordan Love really doesn't pass the eye test, and you say, all right, we'll move Aaron, you're losing value.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you have to think about when is his value at the highest? And if he's off the radar for a season, you're sort of moving into another world. I think his value will always be high because there's also, this is so different than that whole John Elway period, obviously. And front offices view draft picks so differently. I would just look at what it took San Francisco to move up to number 3 from number 12. I mean, there's no way anyone is trading Aaron Rodgers without it being a massive haul in return. And, they've talked about multiple first-round picks and players. But if you move a season out, maybe that just becomes just an incredible array of first-round picks because this is, arguably the best quarterback on earth. I think Tom Brady is, but a lot of people would say, minus the titles, it's Aaron Rodgers. And we also live in a time where, his age back in the Marino days would have been the end of your career. Now, if Aaron Rodgers is, if he has the same makeup as Brady, if he can do what Brady did, you got another 3 or 4 seasons, and it also completely changes your franchise. So the Broncos have always made sense because Elway can't find a quarterback in the draft. He can lure veterans, and that's how he won that other Super Bowl. So, and they have a lot to offer. They're also a team without a surefire starting quarterback for the future. I don't believe in Drew Lock in that way.
So what kind of a player or position of prospect do you think is what Green Bay is looking for that they don't currently have that could potentially sway them? Is it an edge rusher? They already have an elite receiver. They've got a pretty good offensive line. They've got a great secondary. What do you think is the piece that somebody could wave in front of them that can make them actually pick up the phone?
Well, I think it has to be centered on picks. And I don't think they're even thinking that way right now. I just don't think that if you're that Green Bay front office, you don't want this stink on you for the rest of time. I mean, you want to find a resolution. I think that they're dug in on trying to course correct this. And when you hear about, they're trying to give him more money. I mean, that can solve a lot of this. But, when they've talked about like the Broncos traded someone like Noah Fant in return, a premier wide receiver. I mean, what you'd want to do, I think, is do everything you could to create a smooth transition for Jordan Love. I mean, the biggest issue here, I think, is that all the reports of Jordan Love last season, he wasn't even the backup. He was not in any way ready for prime time. I mean, their front office still talked about him being a ways away. And, first of all, you traded up for this guy, and maybe you thought that you could kind of finesse him into the situation for 2 or 3 years, and that Rodgers, the way that, he and Favre had, would accept that transition. But Aaron Rodgers isn't that type of guy. And I think, Jordan Love, what kind of support was he receiving last year in the quarterback room? We don't know. But all reports were he was not ready to play. So him starting games in September is a really perilous route. I mean, you're going from the league MVP to a rookie, a green rookie, who will, the one thing I feel for him is like, he's going to be the opposite of a fan favorite. How many people are going to be in Green Bay excited for Jordan Love if all this thing leads to like an apocalyptic finish? So I also think that from a player angle, a human angle, he's in a really tough spot. And it's a really tough spot for the front office to negotiate if suddenly he's their starter. So I think everything they're doing is saying, we have got to figure this thing out with Aaron Rodgers. But, you can't figure it out with someone that wants to break up with you. You can't control that sometimes.
No. So I want to run a quote by you. I know we both know Dave Damashek. I had him on the show last week. I don't know if you heard the interview, but he had one quote during the interview that I wrote out, and I wanted to run by you and get your opinion on it. We're talking about the AFC North. I know you're a big Browns guy, and he was talking about the Steelers going on, and he turned to the Browns and he said, "It's funny how thoroughly they've been able to hide their quarterback." And I want to get your rebuttal on that statement.
Well, I think, a year ago, you could make an argument, if you really believed in Joe Burrow, that the Browns had the 4th best quarterback in that division, because you were coming off a really messy season. Where I think Dave would be coming from too, where you could also make a case, if you were not a Bakerite, is that Kevin Stefanski's offense, for certain types of quarterbacks, I mean, we saw it with Kirk Cousins, is really wonderful for quarterbacks, and it reduces mistakes and puts you in a position to succeed. I'd also look at Baker and say that, like, part of the issue with Baker was the perception that he was mouthy and all these other things. Well, last year he really couldn't have been more of a team-friendly pro Browns guy. I mean, he did everything they asked, and if you look at the fact that he threw, I think, like 1 interception down the last 7 games of the season, and had a couple really pristine games. I mean, he was, everyone focuses on Big Ben's meltdown in that playoff game. Baker Mayfield, under immense pressure to win Cleveland's first playoff game since January of 1995, played an excellent game. I mean, made big plays, and he played really well against the Chiefs. I mean, he had 1 bad interception, but to me, I think it shows you a quarterback that grew last season. So I don't view him that they have to play around him the way I think about some other quarterbacks. He's not Patrick Mahomes, but man, he can throw it. He's exciting. He can do everything you ask. And if he's never had, like so many of these other quarterbacks in the AFC North, the same coach, even 2 off seasons in a row. And, last off season couldn't have been more chaotic with what was going on. So the fact that whole team came together the way it did, and Baker showed the growth that he did, I would say, it was a no-brainer to give him the 5th-year extension. They didn't give him they're not doing anything beyond that. So you have another year to look at him. If he shows that incremental growth again this season, then, the Baker doubters, need to take a look at what they're saying. Now, when it comes to Damashek, because he and I have had like a friendly war over the Steelers and Browns forever. The other thing from a Browns angle, if you're a Steelers fan, it's like, you went to the playoffs once, for the first time in a million years. You won a playoff game. It came against Pittsburgh. A lot of Browns fans are talking. I get where Dave is coming from in terms of maybe his version of Browns exhaustion. But he and I can talk that out another time.
And then I want to ask, is he still living at the stadium, Baker?
Not that I don't believe so. I mean,
they got to end these commercials.
Well, I think it's any commercial that like the campaign we had. I was surprised there was a second year of it. I mean, let's go and let's do some new stuff. I'm with you.
How do you see the AFC North finishing out this year? Because there's a lot of parity. Who do you think stands atop the rest?
The Steelers and Ravens have really rough schedules, and the Browns aren't far behind them. It isn't going to be like last year. They got the NFC East, and they seem to get all these NFC East teams at the right time. And I think that inflated Pittsburgh's start. It inflated Baltimore's record. It inflated Cleveland's. It's going to be a tougher road this time. It's the NFC North, I believe. But outside of that, like you've got a Ravens team and a Browns team. It used to, if you were the Ravens and Steelers, you could just look at Cincinnati and Cleveland and say, we're going 3-1 at worst against those two teams. And we're going to probably wind up with a bye or a high seed in the AFC because of it. That division is getting a little nastier. And I think with Burrow, healthy, assuming he's totally ready to go, the Bengals are a different type of team. If you look at their offensive weapons, they're not the same old Bengals. I have a few questions about the coaching staff, but I would ticket them fourth. The Steelers, to me, I don't like doubting them because whenever I've done that in the past, they tend to prove you wrong. But on paper right now, there's questions at quarterback with Big Ben. Your offensive line has issues. You got Najee Harris, so you've solved the running back thing, but there are problems on that offensive side of the ball inside in terms of how do you protect Big Ben? So I would just put them, I think, from a talent angle on paper, third. But I would say the Browns maybe are like one game better than the Steelers. And then the Ravens are maybe right there with the Browns or a game better. I mean, Cleveland has not really done much against the Lamar Jackson Ravens other than 2 seasons ago when it's a bit of an outlier. They roughed them up. That Monday night game last year, they hung with them. But for me to put Cleveland number one, they are on paper, but I think they need to go show they can do it on the field. So I give the Ravens a little bit of an advantage.
And I want to ask you, for the teams that selected a quarterback in the first round, do you see any of them having a playoff ceiling this year?
Well, I think Trey Lance, I mean, I don't know Trey Lance, how many games he'll start. I always tend to think that it's more than we think in April with any of these first round rookie quarterbacks, but they should have been a playoff team last year. And they were so banged up. I do believe in Kyle Shanahan. That's a playoff team. That could be, one of the best teams in the NFC. The Jets, I think they're going to be a much more interesting club. Playoffs is strong. Their roster still has holes. I look at the Bears were a playoff team and went and got Justin Fields. That's one of my favorite moments in the entire draft because I think it changes what you think about the Bears. So, they're in the Vikings and Lions make that NFC North manageable for Chicago. And if Aaron Rodgers were to depart from Green Bay, everything changes for Chicago right away. So I'd put the Bears in there. I'd have to think who else, in terms of Jacksonville. No, I don't think that's really realistic. But Mac Jones in New England, I mean, yeah, the Patriots loaded up. And if Mac Jones, I could see Cam Newton opening the year. And if Mac Jones is ready to go, playing a playoff game, absolutely. I think it's kind of a better situation for some of these teams than in years past because it isn't just the worst teams taking quarterbacks. Legit teams are moving up to get quarterbacks, and it's happening in free agency too. Going after Matthew Stafford the way that the Rams did is something that you would never have really seen years ago. And creating a divorce with Jared Goff, it's like they just think a little bit differently.
And then with Washington, they obviously didn't take a quarterback. They didn't trade for one. They didn't trade up for one in the first. They didn't take a quarterback the entire 7 rounds. What do you see their season outlook being like?
Well, they'll be interesting because I think they're well built. Like you can believe in the roster, and it's so much more. It's so much deeper and more intriguing than it was a couple years ago. And what we've been seeing from Ryan Fitzpatrick just seems to be like comfortable in his own skin, comfortable with life. And like, if you get the good version of him, and they've got weapons on that offense, like they could be really frisky. And Taylor Heineke, I think also, showed a little bit. They like Kyle Allen, probably a little bit too much. But these, there's Washington and there's Carolina who did not go after a quarterback. And I get the Sam Darnold potential upside, but I do wonder if Carolina, who passed on Justin Fields, I don't have a problem with them passing on Mac Jones, but to pass on Justin Fields, that's just one of those things where people are going to be remembering about that and thinking about that for a long time to come. If Justin Fields goes to Chicago and completely evolves into something special.
I think Sam Darnold's going to approach 4,000 passing yards this year.
Well, he's in such a better situation. I mean, and that offense also has a lot around him. And it's fair, I think there's just people in all these different camps. There's people in the camp that like Sam Darnold is an awesome quarterback who was in a bad situation. And the other camp, I think, is Sam Darnold actually didn't play very well. And we've seen other quarterbacks on bad teams, lift their team up. And Sam Darnold, was not durable. You can't count on him for 16 games, and he wasn't very good, and he's turnover prone. Now, I mean, he's the perfect example of like, you have to throw out everything we've seen and call it a fresh start and use fresh eyes.
And then I wanted to ask you, so obviously we just finished up the draft. Apparently next draft, there's going to be even more quarterbacks available. Are there any teams in the league this year that you think might be on the last year of their maybe long time or kind of project quarterback?
Well, I mean, if the right quarterback comes along and you're in the right place, the answer would be almost every team. I mean, unless you've got one of those, like a Patrick Mahomes type. But when I look at the Minnesota Vikings, because there was already reports that they were prepared to trade up for their quarterback of choice. And I think that, they're realistic about who Kirk Cousins is. He has like $35 million guaranteed next year, but that would be a 1-year thing. And I know they took Kellen Mond, but that doesn't matter to me. Like, again, it's like any quarterback after the second round, like you just go and get that guy. So, the teams we mentioned, like the whole thing with like Carolina, they talked high about Teddy Bridgewater, then moved on from him. They could be very quickly to move on from Sam Bradford and get their quarterback. I mean, their owner really liked Justin Fields too. I mean, and so did Matt Rule. So that's why I'm mystified with that. But thinking around, it's like there aren't as many teams as there used to be that have huge issues at quarterback. I think that, if some of these, if you get a veteran that flames out, I mean, I don't want to say Cleveland, but if like Baker Mayfield had a really tough season, they're a bold organization right now. They could make a change, but I wouldn't peg them for that at this point. Anything in New England could happen. And, the one place I'd look at, if Tua really, really struggled in Miami, if he really did, then I think they're also a bold organization. And I think Jared Goff is sort of probably waiting to be replaced in Detroit at some point too.
Do you expect Rodgers to get traded this year? Would you be surprised if it happens?
I wouldn't be surprised by anything at this point in that narrative or anything in the NFL. I think the thing about it's exciting for fans and for covering the sport in the last 2 or 3 years, like whatever used to be done, the old way, the old vanguard has just been completely blown up. And again, like you pointed to, like, when is the highest value? If a playoff contender lost their quarterback to injury and came to the Packers and he was refusing to play for Green Bay and it was a place he was open to go, I mean, that's how these things happen. I mean, these things happen off of, like, sometimes it can be a quick succession of phone calls. Sometimes there could be a team secretly talking to Green Bay right now that we're not thinking about, that is prepared to do everything. What are the Houston Texans going to do? I don't trust them, like, to do anything smart right now. But I mean, the landscape will change always at quarterback. And, would I be surprised if it happens? Yes, right now, but I just don't see him being there for a long time unless the money can do it.
And then I want to ask you one last question for you. Who's your breakout team for 2021? Who's the team that's going to shock the world and make the playoffs, potentially go on a run?
Well, I think there's a couple. I mean, if we're talking about someone coming from, like, far away,
Purgatory,
I would keep
purgatory.
I keep an eye on the Broncos. If Teddy played really well, if Drew Lock actually was good, or if they got Aaron Rodgers. I think if they ever got Aaron Rodgers, that's like their roster on offense is Super Bowl worthy, and their defense is fantastic if healthy under Vic Fangio. I have a kind of a special feeling about the Jets. I just think that with Robert Saleh as coach and with Mike LaFleur on offense running like a Kyle Shanahan attack, that they could sneak up. It's just been such a sea change there. I mean, it's not like, look what happened last year. You got a couple trash bag teams that made it to the wild card round. So I'm not saying they're going to shock the nation with their record. But could the Jets go 9-7 if Zach Wilson were awesome? Yeah, why not? And then could they sneak into a playoff game? Why not? And I like the idea of the Bengals too, except just that division's too rough. It's too rough. And I think the other teams I would mention are ones where we wouldn't be surprised by it. The Chargers, to me, could be a Super Bowl team with Justin Herbert. They really could. And I think Brandon Staley is going to surprise a lot of people. But I don't think that's I think a lot of people feel that way about the Chargers.
One of the names I expected you to say that you didn't, I want to ask you about is the Colts. Did they do enough for you this offseason?
Well, I think I wouldn't be surprised if they were a playoff team. I mean, I think the thing is, like, you need to find out what Carson Wentz, to me, is kind of in that Sam Darnold thing, except he has a much better track record. I mean, he's got a good offense around him that, once they get Eric Fisher back at left tackle, and that should be it sounds like about 4 or 5 games in, that offensive line is just so much better than what he was dealing with in Philly last year. And you can look at last year and you can blame him or you can blame the Eagles, but you could blame them both, because there were also games where I thought Carson Wentz walked into sacks, threw a couple of totally beguiling passes that turned into pick sixes and interceptions. And it's got into his head. And so, pairing him with Frank Reich, everyone says that'll do it. And if it will, and if he plays like he did, in seasons prior, they're in really good shape. And I mean, he could be the equal of Phil Rivers there. And they are a playoff team to me. And there's whispers that they are one of the teams in on trading for Julio Jones, and they've got the money to do it. So if you ever added Julio Jones to that, because the Falcons need to trade Julio Jones because of their money situation, not because they don't like him. So if the Colts pulled that off, you look at them entirely differently.
Interesting. Well, that's the only question I really have for you. How can people follow you on social media, keep up with you, and check out the Around the NFL podcast?
So I'm just on Twitter at Marc Sessler, Mark with a C. And we have our shows are 2 times a week right now. It's typically sort of Monday, Thursday, but we'll change it up a little bit. We have a show actually this Wednesday aligned with the schedule release. And we have a Friday show on NFL Network that airs at various times. Check your local listings, because I don't know the exact times. And that's about it. There's other things going on, but once the season gets going, we do more and more shows, and we'll ramp up significantly. So.
Awesome. It's always a pleasure having you on. I do appreciate. Can't wait for the schedule release tomorrow night. I know the teams are going to do something different, creative and virtual, and figure that out. And then I think I saw September 9th is the opener. So hopefully that goes quickly. But it's always a pleasure.
All right, you too. Thank you.